Hello and welcome. As you settle into comfort, prepare yourself for a journey unlike any other. Tonight, we travel not through space but through time. We venture back millions of years to understand one of the most profound mysteries in all of human history. Why did our species, with all our remarkable abilities, evolve in only one place on this vast planet? The answer lies in Africa, a continent that served as both crucible and cradle, forging modern humans through a unique combination of challenges that existed nowhere else on Earth. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. We are about to explore how Africa alone provided the extreme climate variability, geographic isolation, rich predator-prey diversity, and genetic bottlenecks that together transformed primates into intelligent, adaptable, and cooperative modern humans over millions of years. This is not just a story of survival. It is a story of transformation, of how the most demanding environment on the planet shaped minds capable of wondering about their own origins. Close your eyes now and let us begin. The story begins with a simple truth that took humanity centuries to accept. We did not originate everywhere at once. We did not spring from multiple corners of the globe. Every human alive today, regardless of where they now live, can trace their genetic lineage back to a single continent. Africa is not merely one place among many where humans evolved. It is the only place where the lineage that leads to modern Homo sapiens took shape and developed the characteristics that make us human. For much of recorded history, this truth remained hidden. When Charles Darwin published his revolutionary work on evolution in the 1800s, he made a bold prediction based on limited evidence. Looking at the great apes of Africa, particularly chimpanzees and gorillas, he reasoned that humanity's closest relatives lived there. Therefore, he argued, Africa must be where human ancestors originated. But this was merely speculation, a logical deduction without fossil proof. Many scientists of his era rejected the idea entirely, some for scientific reasons, others because of deeply ingrained prejudices that prevented them from accepting Africa as the birthplace of humanity. The first real evidence came in the early 20th century. In 1924, a young anatomist named Raymond Dart examined a remarkable fossil found in a limestone quarry at Tong, South Africa. The skull belonged to a child, but it was unlike any ape skull Dart had ever seen. The brain was small, not much larger than a chimpanzee's, yet the face was flatter, more human-like. Most telling was the position of the foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord enters the skull. Its placement indicated that this creature walked upright on two legs, a distinctly human characteristic. Dart named it Australopithecus africanus, meaning the southern ape of Africa. The scientific community greeted Dart's findings with profound skepticism. Many dismissed his claims outright. The resistance stemmed partly from scientific caution, but also from something darker. The idea that humans arose from Africa challenged deeply held assumptions about human superiority and racial hierarchies. How could the highest form of life have emerged from what colonial powers then considered the least developed continent? It was a prejudice dressed in scientific language, but prejudice nonetheless. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate. In 1936, Robert Broom discovered the first adult Australopithecus fossil in the Sterkfontein Caves, also in South Africa. More discoveries followed throughout the 20th century, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. The Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania yielded fossilized remains spanning millions of years. Lake Turkana in Kenya became one of the richest sources of early human fossils on Earth. Ethiopia produced Lucy, a remarkably complete skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis dating back more than 3 million years, her pelvis and leg bones proving beyond doubt but our ancestors walked upright long before their brains grew large. These fossils told a story that could no longer be ignored. The earliest members of the human lineage, the Australopithecines, lived exclusively in Africa between roughly 7 million and 2 million years ago. They were followed by the genus Homo, our own genus, which emerged around 2.5 million years ago. The first species, Homo habilis, had slightly larger brains and used simple stone tools. They gave rise to Homo erectus, who possessed even larger brains and more sophisticated technology. Some Homo erectus populations eventually left Africa, spreading across Asia and Europe between 1.8 million and 1 million years ago. But the crucial evolutionary developments that led to modern humans continue to unfold in Africa. Around 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, appeared in the fossil record. The earliest known fossils come from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and Omo Kaibish in Ethiopia, both in Africa. These early Homo sapiens had high foreheads, smaller faces, and brain sizes similar to modern humans. Their behavior too began showing signs of modernity. They created complex tools, used ochre for symbolic purposes, and developed sophisticated hunting strategies. By 100,000 years ago, they were producing shell beads for personal adornment and creating the earliest known examples of abstract art. Genetics confirmed what the fossils suggested. When researchers began analyzing DNA from people around the world, they discovered that all living humans share a relatively recent common ancestor who lived in Africa. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down through mothers, traces back to a woman who lived in Africa roughly 150,000 years ago. Y chromosome DNA, inherited from fathers, points to a man who lived in Africa around a similar time. The genetic diversity found in African populations exceeds that of all other populations combined. This makes sense only if humanity lived in Africa longer than anywhere else, accumulating genetic variations over hundreds of thousands of years before small groups migrated outward. The migration out of Africa occurred relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Modern humans began leaving Africa in significant numbers between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. A small population crossed from northeast Africa into the Arabian Peninsula and then spread across Asia, Europe, and eventually to Australia and the Americas. This exodus created a genetic bottleneck. Only a subset of Africa's genetic diversity made the journey, which explains why non-African populations show less genetic variation than African ones. Every person whose ancestors came from Europe, Asia, Australia, or the Americas carries DNA that passed through that narrow bottleneck, a genetic signature of their African origins. But why? Why did this transformation occur in Africa and nowhere else? Why didn't similar evolutionary developments happen simultaneously in Asia, Europe, or other parts of the world? The answer is not simple. It involves an intricate interplay of factors that came together in Africa in ways they did not elsewhere. Climate, geography, ecology, and chance all played roles. Understanding these factors requires us to look closely at what made Africa unique during the critical period when humans were evolving. Africa is not a uniform place. It is a continent of extraordinary diversity, containing deserts and rainforests, mountains and plains, savannas and wetlands. This diversity is not merely scenic. It represents different ecological zones, each with its own challenges and opportunities. More importantly, these zones change dramatically over time, sometimes rapidly, sometimes slowly, but always in ways that demanded adaptation from the creatures living there. No other place on Earth experienced quite the same combination of environmental pressures during the period when human ancestors were evolving. The key lies in understanding that human evolution was not a smooth, gradual process. It was punctuated by rapid changes, periods of intense selection pressure that winnowed populations and rewarded those with advantageous traits. These pressures came from many sources, but they all had one thing in common. They existed with particular intensity in Africa. The extreme climate variability, the geographic barriers that isolated populations, the diverse array of predators and prey, and the periodic population crashes that reduced our ancestors to tiny, struggling groups all combined to create an evolutionary pressure cooker that forged the human mind and body. Let us now explore each of these factors in turn, beginning with perhaps the most important, the wild, unpredictable swings of Africa's climate during the period when humans were evolving. Imagine a world where the landscape around you transforms within a single lifetime. Forests give way to grasslands. Lakes appear where deserts once stood, then vanish again within a few thousand years. Rainfall patterns shift, sometimes bringing abundance, sometimes devastating drought. This is not science fiction. This is Africa during the Pleistocene epoch, the period between 2.6 million years ago and 11,700 years ago, when the human lineage underwent its most dramatic transformations. Climate change shaped human evolution, but not in the way many people imagine. It was not a single catastrophic event, nor was it a smooth, gradual warming or cooling. Instead, Africa experienced what scientists call pulsed climate variability, rapid oscillations between wet and dry conditions, between warm and cold periods, creating an environment where adaptation was not merely advantageous but necessary for survival. Those who could not adapt perished. Those who could adapt thrived, and in the process they evolved. The story begins with Earth's orbital cycles. Our planet does not move through space in a perfectly consistent manner. Its orbit around the Sun changes shape over a cycle of roughly 100,000 years, sometimes more circular, sometimes more elliptical. The tilt of Earth's axis, currently about 23.5 degrees, varies between 22 and 24.5 degrees over a 41,000-year cycle. Earth also wobbles on its axis like a spinning top, completing a full cycle every 26,000 years. These variations, known as Milankovitch cycles, affect how much sunlight different parts of Earth receive at different times of year. The changes might seem minor, but their effects cascade through the climate system, triggering ice ages and interglacial periods, altering rainfall patterns and reshaping ecosystems. Africa felt these changes acutely, but in complex ways that differed from region to region. When ice sheets expanded across the northern hemisphere during glacial periods, the effects rippled southward. The tropical rain belt, also known as the intertropical convergence zone, shifted position. This belt of heavy rainfall, which today moves north and south with the seasons, determines whether regions receive life-giving rain or endure withering drought. During glacial periods, the rain belt often shifted southward, bringing moisture to southern Africa while leaving equatorial and northern regions parched. During interglacial periods, the pattern reversed. Northern Africa could bloom with vegetation while the south dried out. The East African Rift Valley experienced these changes with particular intensity. This great geological scar, where the African continent is slowly tearing itself apart, created a landscape of dramatic contrasts. Mountains rose to heights of more than 4,000 meters, their peaks sometimes covered in ice and snow even near the equator. Between these mountains lay a series of basins, many containing lakes whose levels fluctuated wildly with changes in rainfall. During wet periods, these lakes expanded, becoming vast inland seas teeming with fish and attracting herds of animals to their shores. During dry periods, they shrank to mere puddles or vanished entirely, leaving behind salt flats and barren plains. Scientists studying sediment cores from these ancient lake beds have reconstructed a detailed picture of East African climate over the past several million years. The patterns they found are striking. Approximately 2.8 million years ago, when the first stone tools appeared in the archaeological record, East Africa was undergoing a major environmental transition. Long-term cooling and drying caused forests to give way to more open woodlands and grasslands. But this transition was not smooth. It was punctuated by wild swings between extremely wet and extremely dry conditions, occurring on timescales of hundreds to thousands of years. Around 1.8 million years ago, another major shift occurred. This coincided with a significant increase in brain size among human ancestors and the appearance of Homo erectus, the first human species with body proportions similar to modern humans. Climate records show that this period saw the establishment of particularly strong orbital forcing of climate, meaning Earth's orbital variations began having more pronounced effects on regional climates. The East African lakes became highly variable, expanding and contracting dramatically over cycles of 23,000 years, matching the precession cycle of Earth's wobble. These rapidly changing environments created what evolutionary biologists call a variable selection pressure. In a stable environment, natural selection tends to favor specialists, organisms finely tuned to extract maximum benefit from specific conditions. But in a highly variable environment, specialists become vulnerable. When conditions change, their specialized adaptations may become liabilities. Instead, variable environments favor generalists, organisms capable of adapting to different conditions, of finding food and shelter in diverse circumstances, of solving new problems as they arise. Generalists need flexibility. They need intelligence. They need creativity. The post-climate variability hypothesis, developed by scientists studying African climate and human evolution, proposes that these rapid environmental oscillations drove key adaptations in the human lineage. When forests shrank and grasslands expanded, our ancestors had to adapt to more open environments. They descended from the trees more frequently, walked longer distances between food sources, and faced greater exposure to predators. This favored bipedalism, walking on two legs, which freed the hands for carrying food and tools while allowing individuals to see over tall grasses to spot both opportunities and threats. But climate changes did not just happen once. They happened repeatedly, each swing presenting new challenges. Sometimes resources were plentiful, supporting larger populations. At other times, resources became scarce, forcing populations to shrink and scatter. Sometimes the environment favored certain foods, plants or animals, requiring different foraging strategies. At other times, it favored others. This variability meant that rigid behavioral patterns became dangerous. Survival required behavioral flexibility, the ability to adjust strategies as circumstances changed. Consider the archaeological evidence from Alarj Salih in southern Kenya. This site preserves a remarkable record spanning more than 1 million years. For hundreds of thousands of years, the people living at Alarj Salih made large hand axes, stone tools shaped symmetrically on both sides, used for butchering animals and processing plant materials. These Ishulian hand axes remained virtually unchanged for an extraordinarily long time, a testament to their effectiveness. But around 320,000 years ago, something dramatic happened. The hand axes vanished from the archaeological record, replaced by smaller, more diverse stone tools, including carefully shaped points that could be attached to spears. This technological transition coincided with a major environmental change. Climate records from the same period show a shift from relatively stable conditions to increasingly variable ones. The landscape became more unpredictable, oscillating between wetter and drier states more frequently. The old tools, which worked well in the relatively stable earlier environment, no longer sufficed. The new tools reflected a different approach: versatility, adaptability, and sophistication. Their makers had to understand the properties of different types of stone, master complex shaping techniques, and plan ahead, creating tools for specific purposes rather than all-purpose implements. Northern Africa experienced its own dramatic climate swings, though different from those in East Africa. The Sahara Desert, today one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, was not always so barren. During humid periods, when orbital configurations brought more rainfall to the region, the Sahara bloomed. Grasslands and scattered trees covered areas that are now sand dunes. Lakes and rivers crisscrossed the landscape. Animals thrived, and human populations expanded northward, occupying territories that would later become impassable desert. These humid periods, sometimes called African humid periods or Green Sahara events, occurred multiple times during the past few 100,000 years. They typically lasted several thousand years before the climate shifted again, rainfall decreased, and the desert returned. Archaeological sites from these humid periods contain evidence of human occupation deep within what is now the Sahara. Stone tools, animal bones, and even rock art depicting giraffes, elephants, and other savanna animals testified at times when people lived and thrived in regions that would later become uninhabitable. The transitions between humid and arid periods were often surprisingly rapid. Studies of marine sediment cores from off the coast of West Africa show that the changes could occur within a few centuries or even decades. Imagine being part of a population that had lived for generations beside a river, depending on its water and the plants and animals it supported, only to see that river dry up within your lifetime. Your children would grow up in a different world than you did, one requiring different knowledge and different strategies for survival. This was the reality for human ancestors in Africa. Southern Africa, too, experienced climate variability, though its patterns differed yet again from those in the east and north. The southern coastal regions were strongly influenced by sea level changes tied to global ice age cycles. During glacial maxima, when ice sheets locked up massive amounts of water, global sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. This exposed vast areas of the continental shelf, creating new coastal plains. Rivers carved deep valleys through these exposed areas, and unique vegetation communities established themselves in these new environments. Human populations could expand into these newly available territories, exploiting marine resources along the coastline and terrestrial resources inland. When glacial periods ended and temperatures rose, ice sheets melted and sea levels rose again, sometimes by more than 120 meters over several thousand years. The rising waters drowned the coastal plains, forcing human populations to retreat inland. Communities that had lived for generations near the ancient coastline found their territories submerged beneath the waves. They had to adapt once more, finding new resources and establishing new settlement patterns. These repeated cycles of expansion and contraction, of dispersal and concentration, shaped human populations in southern Africa just as climate pulses shaped populations elsewhere on the continent. Recent research has revealed another layer of complexity in African climate history. Scientists analyzing pollen records, sediment cores, and climate models have identified what they call the African climate seesaw. For at least the past 600,000 years, Eastern and Western Africa experienced climate changes that were often out of phase with each other. When Eastern Africa became wetter, Western Africa tended to become drier, and vice versa. This pattern, likely driven by shifts in the Walker circulation, the atmospheric circulation pattern over the tropical Pacific, meant that different regions of Africa experienced different environmental pressures at different times. The implications for human evolution are profound. Populations in Eastern Africa might face drought and resource scarcity at the same time that populations in Western Africa enjoyed wetter conditions and resource abundance. This regional variability meant that Africa as a whole provided a patchwork of environments, some challenging, some favorable, constantly shifting over time. This prevented extinction. If a climate shift devastated populations in one region, others might serve as refugia, safe havens where populations survived. Later, when conditions changed again, survivors from the refugia could expand back into previously uninhabitable regions, carrying with them any new adaptations they had developed during their isolation. The climate variability of Africa during the Pleistocene was not merely a backdrop against which human evolution occurred. It was an active force driving change, rewarding innovation, and punishing inflexibility. The human brain, with its remarkable capacity for learning, problem-solving, and cultural transmission of knowledge, evolved in this context. Our ancestors needed to remember where water could be found during droughts, how to track animals across changing landscapes, which plants were edible during which seasons, and how to adapt when familiar resources disappeared. This required not just intelligence but a particular kind of intelligence, one suited to dealing with unpredictability and change. Other parts of the world experienced climate changes during the same period, but not with the same intensity or the same patterns. Europe and Northern Asia faced massive ice sheets during glacial periods, but these regions were largely inhospitable to hominin populations. Southern Asia and Southeast Asia experienced climate changes, but they were generally less extreme and more predictable than those in Africa. Only in Africa did the combination of tropical and subtropical climates, Varied topography and orbital forcing create the precise patterns of variability that evolutionary biologists believe were so critical in driving human evolution. As you process this information, let your mind wander across those ancient African landscapes. Picture forests appearing and vanishing, lakes filling and emptying, grasslands expanding and contracting, all within spans of time short enough that traditions could remember, that knowledge could preserve, that cultures could adapt to and prepare for. This was the climate laboratory of human evolution, a testing ground unlike any other place on Earth. Climate variability shaped the pressures human ancestors faced, but geography determined how populations responded to those pressures. Africa's physical landscape, with its mountains, deserts, forests, and rivers, created barriers that isolated populations from one another. These barriers were not absolute. They were permeable, allowing movement during certain times but restricting it during others. This pattern of repeated isolation and occasional contact played a crucial role in human evolution, creating conditions that promoted the development of new traits while still allowing beneficial innovations to spread. The concept might seem contradictory at first. How could isolation, which limits contact between populations, promote evolution toward a single species rather than multiple divergent species? The answer lies in understanding the difference between complete and partial isolation. Complete isolation, the kind that separates populations on different continents or distant islands for millions of years, leads to speciation, the development of distinct species that can no longer interbreed. Partial isolation, the kind created by geographic barriers that sometimes block movement and sometimes allow it, creates something different: population structure. Population structure means that a species exists not as a single, well-mixed population but as multiple subpopulations that interact occasionally. These subpopulations experience somewhat different environmental pressures and may develop somewhat different traits. But they remain part of the same species because periodic contact allows genetic material to flow between them. When conditions favor it, individuals from one subpopulation migrate to join another, bringing new genes with them. This gene flow prevents the subpopulations from diverging so completely that they become separate species, but it does not prevent them from developing local adaptations suited to their particular environments. The subdivided population model of human evolution, supported by an increasing body of fossil, archaeological, and genetic evidence, proposes that Homo sapiens evolved through interactions among multiple African subpopulations rather than within a single population in one part of Africa. This model contrasts with earlier views that placed human origins in a specific region, either East Africa or South Africa, and imagined a single population gradually evolving modern traits before expanding across Africa and eventually beyond. What created this population structure? Africa's geography provides multiple barriers that could isolate populations from each other while still allowing occasional contact. The Sahara Desert, during its arid phases, formed a formidable barrier between northern and sub-Saharan Africa. Humans could cross it during humid periods when grasslands and scattered water sources made the journey feasible, but during dry periods, it became nearly impassable. This created a pattern where North African populations were sometimes connected to and sometimes isolated from populations farther south. The great rainforests of Central Africa, particularly those in the Congo Basin, formed another kind of barrier. Dense tropical rainforest, with its unique challenges and required adaptations, discouraged movement by populations adapted to open woodlands and savannas. Genetic studies of modern African populations show that rainforest-adapted groups, such as the Pygmy peoples of Central Africa, have been genetically distinct from neighboring agriculturalists for tens of thousands of years. Their ancestors may have become isolated in forest refugia during periods of climate change, developing unique adaptations for forest life that made them less suited to savanna environments, while savanna populations developed traits that made them less suited to forests. Mountain ranges created physical barriers that could isolate populations living in highland areas from those in lowlands. The Ethiopian highlands, rising more than 4,000 meters above sea level, provided a distinct environment with cooler temperatures, different vegetation, and unique challenges. Populations living there could develop traits adapted to high altitude, including physiological changes for coping with lower oxygen levels, while remaining genetically connected to lowland populations during times when movement between highlands and lowlands was more common. The East African Rift Valley itself, with its dramatic topography, created a complex landscape of barriers and corridors. The eastern and western branches of the rift are separated by the central plateau, and within each branch, a series of mountains, lakes, and valleys further subdivides the landscape. A population living in the Turkana Basin might be partially isolated from populations living around Lake Victoria or in the Olduvai region, with the degree of isolation varying depending on climate conditions. During wetter periods, when vegetation was more continuous, movement between basins might have been easier. During drier periods, the barriers became more formidable. Southern Africa presents its own geographic complexity. The Cape Fold Belt, a series of mountain ranges in the southwestern part of the continent, creates a barrier between the coastal regions and the interior. During periods of low sea level, when glacial maxima exposed the continental shelf, these mountains helped isolate populations on the expanded coastal plain from those living on the interior plateau. This isolation, lasting for thousands of years during each glacial period, might have allowed coastal populations to develop unique adaptations before reconnecting with interior populations during interglacial periods when sea level rose. Rivers, too, acted as barriers, though less permanent ones than mountains or deserts. Large rivers like the Nile, Congo, Niger, and Zambezi could be difficult to cross, especially during flood stages. Small rivers that seemed minor obstacles during dry seasons could become raging torrents during rainy seasons. The shifting courses of rivers over thousands of years meant that populations separated by a river in one era might find the barrier gone in another, only to have a different river form elsewhere, creating new patterns of isolation. Recent research using computer simulations and genetic data has shown that even relatively modest geographic barriers can maintain population structure over long periods if the barriers persist across many generations. A mountain range does not need to be completely impassable. It merely needs to be difficult enough to cross that most individuals stay on one side during their lifetimes. Over dozens or hundreds of generations, this results in populations on either side of the barrier becoming genetically distinct, even though occasional migrants cross the barrier and contribute genes to both sides. The fossil record provides tangible evidence of this population structure during human evolution. Fossils identified as early Homo sapiens appear at different sites across Africa, from Morocco in the northwest to Ethiopia and Kenya in the east to South Africa in the south, spanning from about 300,000 years ago to roughly 100,000 years ago. These fossils do not show a simple progression from archaic to modern features. Instead, they display a mosaic pattern. Some fossils have features that look quite modern alongside features that seem more archaic. Different fossils from different regions show different combinations of features. This mosaic pattern makes sense if we think of human evolution as occurring across a structured African population rather than within a single population at one location. Different subpopulations might have evolved different modern features at different times. The fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 315,000 years ago, show faces that look quite modern but brain cases that are somewhat elongated, more like those of earlier humans. Fossils from Homo Kaibish in Ethiopia, dated to around 195,000 years ago, show more globular brain cases, more like modern humans, but other features that seem more archaic. Fossils from Florisbad in South Africa, dated to around 260,000 years ago, show yet another combination of features. If these were completely separate populations evolving independently, we might expect them to diverge into distinct species. But they did not. Instead, gene flow between populations, occasional enough not to homogenize them completely but frequent enough to maintain species cohesion, kept them connected. When a subpopulation developed an advantageous trait, whether physical or behavioral, that trait could eventually spread to other subpopulations through migration and interbreeding. This allowed innovations to accumulate across the entire African metapopulation, the network of connected subpopulations, rather than being confined to isolated groups. The archaeological record shows similar patterns. Stone tool technologies varied across Africa during the Middle Stone Age, the period between about 300,000 and 30,000 years ago. In East Africa, people made particular types of points and blades. In North Africa, they made somewhat different tool types. In Southern Africa, still others. These regional traditions persisted for thousands of years, suggesting relative isolation between regions. But occasionally, traits that originated in one region appear in others, suggesting episodes of contact and cultural exchange. One striking example involves the use of ochre, iron-rich rocks that produce red or yellow pigment when ground. Sites in southern Africa contain evidence of ochre processing dating back more than 100,000 years, with elaborate grinding equipment, shells used as containers for pigments, and marked pieces of ochre that may represent early symbolic engravings. This sophisticated use of ochre appears earlier in southern Africa than elsewhere, suggesting that populations there developed this technology first. But eventually, ochre use appears at sites across Africa, indicating that the innovation spread, likely through population movements and cultural transmission to other regions. Genetic evidence supports the subdivided population model as well. When scientists analyze the DNA of living African populations and compare it with ancient DNA extracted from fossils, they find patterns consistent with ancient population structure. African populations show more genetic diversity than non-African populations, as expected if humanity lived in Africa longer. But they also show patterns suggesting that different African populations were partially isolated from each other for extended periods. Statistical analyses of genetic variation can detect these ancient episodes of separation and reconnection, revealing a complex history of population movements, isolations, and admixtures. One particularly important finding concerns the genetic structure of present-day African populations. Studies have identified at least 14 genetically distinct ancestral population clusters within Africa, groups that were at least partially isolated from each other for significant periods. The divergence times between some of these clusters extend back tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, long before the migration of modern humans out of Africa. This suggests that the population structure, the pattern of partially isolated subpopulations, existed throughout the period when modern human features were evolving. The alternating periods of isolation and contact created by Africa's geographic barriers had multiple evolutionary effects. During periods of isolation, each subpopulation experienced its own unique selection pressures based on local environmental conditions. A population living in a high-altitude region faced selection for altitude adaptations. A population living near coasts exploited marine resources, favoring traits useful for coastal foraging. A population living in arid regions needed strategies for finding and conserving water. Each subpopulation adapted to its local circumstances, potentially developing traits that would have been less advantageous in other environments. But these adaptations did not necessarily disappear when populations reconnected. When migrants from one population joined another, they brought their genes and their cultural knowledge with them. If their traits proved useful in the new environment, they spread through the population. If not, they might persist at low frequencies or gradually disappear. This process, occurring repeatedly across many populations and many generations, created a pool of genetic and cultural diversity that could be drawn upon when circumstances changed. When a new environmental challenge arose, perhaps a climate shift or a new predator or disease, the ancestral population might already contain genetic variants that helped cope with the challenge, present in some subpopulations but not others, ready to spread when they became advantageous. This dynamic process, isolation followed by contact followed by isolation again, repeated over hundreds of thousands of years, helps explain why human evolution proceeded so rapidly during the Middle and Late Pleistocene. Each subpopulation served as an experiment, testing different genetic and cultural combinations under different environmental conditions. Successful experiments, those that enhanced survival and reproduction, spread when populations reconnected. Unsuccessful ones disappeared or remained confined to local populations. The entire African continent became, in effect, a laboratory for human evolution, with multiple experiments running simultaneously, their results periodically combined and tested under new conditions. No other region of the world during this period had quite the same combination of climate zones, topographic complexity, and population history that could create this kind of structured metapopulation. Asia was too vast, with populations too scattered and environmental transitions too gradual to create the particular pattern of repeated isolation and reconnection. Europe, still partly covered by ice sheets during glacial periods, supported smaller hominin populations and had less environmental diversity within the habitable zones. Only Africa, with its unique geography and climate history, provided the conditions for this evolutionary process. As you drift deeper into relaxation, picture these ancient populations separated by deserts and mountains and forests, each developing their own traditions, their own adaptations, their own solutions to survival's challenges. Then imagine the rare travelers who crossed the barriers, bringing new genes, new ideas, new possibilities to the groups they joined. This was the pattern that shaped humanity. Africa is not merely a place of climate swings and geographic barriers. It is also home to the most diverse community of large mammals on Earth. Lions and leopards, hyenas and wild dogs, cheetahs and crocodiles prowl its savannas and waterways. Elephants, rhinoceroses, buffalo, and countless species of antelopes graze its grasslands and browse its woodlands. This rich ecological community, particularly the abundance of both predators and prey, created pressures that shaped human evolution in fundamental ways. Our early ancestors were neither apex predators nor helpless prey. They occupied a precarious middle position, sometimes hunters, sometimes scavengers, sometimes prey themselves. This liminal status, combined with the need to interact with a complex ecosystem of dangerous carnivores and fleet-footed herbivores, created cognitive demands that drove the evolution of intelligence, cooperation, and technology. Understanding this requires stepping back several million years to when our ancestors were much more ape-like than human-like. The Australopithecines, those early bipedal apes discovered by Raymond Dart and others, lived in eastern and southern Africa between approximately 4 million and 2 million years ago. They were small by modern standards, adults standing perhaps 100 to 140 centimeters tall, weighing perhaps 30 to 40 kilograms. They had brains only slightly larger than chimpanzees, around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, compared to the 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters typical of modern humans. Despite their relatively small brains, the Australopithecines had made one crucial evolutionary innovation. They walked upright on two legs. Bipedalism freed their hands, allowing them to carry objects, manipulate tools, and throw projectiles while moving. But it also made them vulnerable. They could no longer climb trees as efficiently as their quadrupedal ancestors. They could not run as fast as the four-legged predators that shared their environment. They needed new strategies to survive. The fossil record preserves evidence of their vulnerability. In southern Africa, scientists have found Australopithecine fossils bearing the marks of predator attacks. One skull shows puncture wounds that match perfectly with the spacing of a leopard's canine teeth. Another skeleton of a young Australopithecine was found in a cave alongside the remains of other animals, apparently dragged there by a predator. These were not theoretical threats. Early hominins actually fell prey to the carnivores with which they shared the landscape. Africa during the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs supported a carnivore guild, a community of meat-eating species that was both diverse and formidable. Lions, though somewhat smaller than modern African lions, hunted in groups, capable of bringing down prey much larger than themselves. Saber-toothed cats, now extinct, possessed enormous canine teeth designed for puncturing the flesh of large prey. Leopards, then as now, were solitary ambush predators, incredibly strong for their size, able to drag kills twice their weight up into trees. Spotted hyenas, often dismissed as mere scavengers, were and are effective hunters with bone-crushing jaws capable of consuming nearly every part of a carcass. Wild dogs hunted in packs with remarkable coordination, running down prey through endurance rather than speed. Crocodiles lurked in rivers and lakes, waiting to ambush animals that came to drink. Large pythons could constrict and consume prey as large as antelope. Even birds presented threats. Martial eagles, crowned eagles, and other large raptors were capable of taking young or small hominins as prey. The landscape was a gauntlet of predators, each employing different hunting strategies, active at different times of day or night, specializing in different prey but all opportunistic enough to target vulnerable hominins when the chance arose. Surviving in this environment required constant vigilance. It required understanding predator behavior, knowing where leopards preferred to hunt, when lions were most active, how to recognize the signs of nearby hyenas. It required social cooperation, individuals watching for dangers that others might miss, groups defending against threats that would overwhelm lone individuals. It required intelligence, the ability to assess risks, make decisions quickly, and learn from experience. The first stone tools appear in the archaeological record around 2.6 million years ago, just as the genus Homo was emerging from Australopithecine ancestors. These Oldowan tools, named after Olduvai Gorge where they were first identified, were simple sharp flakes struck from cores of suitable stone. They do not look impressive to modern eyes, barely modified rocks. But they represented a cognitive leap, the understanding that one object could be used to modify another, creating a tool more effective than either original object. More importantly, sharp stone flakes could cut through hide and meat far more efficiently than teeth or fingernails, allowing early humans to process animal carcasses that they found or obtained through hunting or scavenging. The question of whether early humans were primarily hunters or scavengers has generated much debate. The answer appears to be both, depending on circumstances and opportunities. Evidence from cut marks on ancient bones shows that humans with stone tools sometimes had first access to carcasses, cutting into areas of meat before carnivores gnawed the bones. This suggests hunting or very early scavenging. Other times, the patterns suggest humans arrived later, after carnivores had consumed the prime meat, leaving humans to extract marrow from bones, a calorie-rich resource that hyenas and other predators could not easily access without human tools to crack the bones open. This mixed strategy, hunting when possible, scavenging when necessary, required keen observational skills and ecological knowledge. Successful scavengers needed to understand predator behavior well enough to locate recent kills before other scavengers arrived. They needed to recognize circling vultures that might indicate a nearby carcass. They needed to approach cautiously, watching for predators that might still be feeding or lurking nearby. They needed to work quickly, extracting meat and marrow before larger predators returned or new ones arrived. Hunting presented different challenges but required equally sophisticated cognitive abilities. The prey animals of Pleistocene Africa were diverse and challenging to hunt. Some, like zebras and wildebeest, lived in large herds and could run at sustained speeds far exceeding human capabilities. Others, like buffalo, were large, dangerous, and willing to fight back aggressively. Still others, like various antelope species, were wary and alert, fleeing at the slightest hint of danger. Early humans could not outrun these animals in a sprint. They could not overpower them in direct confrontation. They needed strategy. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests they employed techniques that emphasized human strengths: endurance, communication, and planning. Persistence hunting, practiced until recently by some sand peoples of southern Africa, exploits the fact that humans can run long distances in hot conditions better than most other mammals. By tracking and pursuing prey animals during the heat of the day, forcing them to run repeatedly. Hunters could exhaust animals until they collapsed from heat stress, allowing humans to approach safely and dispatch them. This technique requires extensive knowledge, the ability to track animals by their footprints, to interpret signs like broken vegetation or disturbed soil, to understand animal behavior well enough to predict where a fleeing animal will go. It requires communication, hunters working together to coordinate movements, to signal the animal's location, to plan strategy. It requires endurance, the physical and mental stamina to keep going for hours under difficult conditions. It requires technological innovation, water containers to prevent dehydration, weapons to finish the exhausted prey, cutting tools to butcher the carcass. By around 1.8 million years ago, coinciding with the appearance of Homo erectus, the archaeological record shows evidence of more sophisticated hunting. The Aeschylean hand axes that become common during this period were more carefully shaped than Oldowan tools, requiring more planning and skill to manufacture. Sites contain concentrations of animal bones suggesting that humans were bringing significant amounts of meat back to specific locations, possibly base camps. Some sites show evidence of controlled fire use, though the earliest definitive hearths date to much later. Fire, once mastered, would have provided protection against predators, light during dark hours, warmth during cool nights, and the ability to cook food, making it easier to digest and killing parasites. The interplay between humans and predators shaped more than just hunting strategies. It influenced social behavior and group structure. Living in groups provided protection against predators. Many pairs of eyes spotted dangers sooner than one. Many individuals could mount a defense that a lone individual could not. This created selection pressure for traits that facilitated group living. The ability to communicate, to cooperate, to form social bonds, to coordinate activities. Language, one of humanity's most distinctive features, may have evolved partly in response to these pressures. While the origins of language remain debated and uncertain, many researchers believe that the need to communicate about threats, opportunities, and plans would have favored increasingly sophisticated forms of communication. A hominin who could warn others of a nearby predator, who could describe the location of a carcass to scavenge, who could coordinate with others during a hunt, had significant survival advantages over one who could not communicate such information. Theory of mind, the ability to understand that others have thoughts, beliefs, and intentions different from one's own, also likely evolved in this context. Successfully cooperating with others requires understanding what they know and what they intend. Predicting what a prey animal or predator will do next requires simulating their mental states. What they can see, what they want, how they will respond to various situations. These cognitive abilities, which develop naturally in human children but seem limited in other species, may have their roots in the challenges of surviving in a complex ecosystem of dangerous predators and elusive prey. The diversity of African predators created a particularly challenging environment that selected for flexible, general intelligence rather than specialized anti-predator adaptations. If early hominins had faced only a single type of predator, evolution might have favored specific defenses effective against that threat. But facing multiple predator species, each employing different hunting strategies, required flexible responses. The appropriate behavior when encountering a lion differed from the appropriate behavior when encountering a leopard or a crocodile or a snake. Recognizing the threat, assessing the situation, and choosing an appropriate response required cognitive flexibility and learning ability. Comparative studies of primate behavior provide insights into how predation pressure shapes intelligence. Species living in environments with high predation pressure tend to be more vigilant, more social, and more intelligent than closely related species in safer environments. The African great apes, particularly chimpanzees and bonobos, show sophisticated cognitive abilities including tool use, social learning, and cooperation. But even these species do not reach human levels of technological sophistication or cultural complexity. The additional pressures faced by hominins, partially bipedal and thus more vulnerable than their tree-climbing relatives, Living in more open habitats with less refuge may have intensified selection for intelligence beyond what other African primates experienced. The transition from prey to predator was gradual and never complete. Even as human ancestors became more effective hunters, they remained vulnerable to attack. Evidence from more recent periods, including the archaeological records from sites occupied by early Homo sapiens, continues to show evidence of predation on humans. A case from South Africa involves a skull from a child dated to about 1.5 million years ago, showing damage consistent with an eagle attack. Modern observations confirm that large eagles can and do take primates as prey in Africa, suggesting that even relatively large-brained hominins face these dangers. But over time, the balance shifted. By the time Homo sapiens appeared, humans had become sophisticated hunters capable of taking the largest prey animals. Sites from the late Pleistocene contain remains of elephants, hippos, and other megafauna with butchery marks, evidence that humans hunted or scavenged these enormous animals. The weapons became more sophisticated: spears with hafted stone points, later bows and arrows, nets and traps, all technologies requiring considerable knowledge to manufacture and skill to use effectively. The African ecosystem, with its unique combination of predator diversity, prey variety, and human vulnerability, created an evolutionary arms race. Prey animals evolved better defenses, greater speed, sharper senses, larger herds, more aggressive responses to threats. Predators evolved better hunting strategies, improved speed, stronger jaws, better camouflage, more sophisticated cooperation. And humans, caught in the middle, evolved bigger brains, better tools, more sophisticated communication, and more complex social structures. The result was not merely survival but transformation, the evolution of a species unlike any that had existed before. No other continent during the Pleistocene presented quite the same ecological challenges. Eurasia had large predators, but hominin populations there were newcomers, Homo erectus and later Neanderthals, entering ecosystems where they had not evolved and often occupying marginal habitats less densely populated with megafauna. The Americas, Australia, and other regions lacked hominins entirely until much later, their megafauna having evolved without hominin presence. Only in Africa did hominins evolve alongside a diverse carnivore and herbivore community over millions of years, creating the specific ecological pressures that shaped human intelligence, cooperation, and culture. Let these images settle into your mind as you relax further. Ancient humans moving cautiously through tall grass, watching for predators, scanning for prey, working together with their companions, communicating through sounds and gestures, planning strategies that required thinking ahead, learning from experience, teaching the young. This was the world that forged human cognition. The story of human evolution is not only one of gradual change and adaptation. It also includes moments of crisis, times when populations shrank to tiny numbers, when extinction seemed possible. These population bottlenecks, periods when only a small fraction of a species survives, can have profound evolutionary consequences. They reduce genetic diversity, eliminating many genetic variants from the population. But they can also accelerate evolution by intensifying selection pressure and creating opportunities for rapid change. Africa's climate instability and environmental variability created multiple such bottlenecks during human evolution, and genetic evidence suggests these near-extinction events played crucial roles in shaping our species. A genetic bottleneck occurs when a population decreases dramatically in size, whether from disease, famine, climate catastrophe, or other causes. The survivors represent only a small fraction of the original population's genetic diversity. When the population eventually recovers and grows again, all descendant individuals trace their ancestry back to those few survivors. The genetic signatures of ancient bottlenecks persist in modern DNA, visible as reductions in genetic variation and particular patterns of genetic relatedness. Scientists studying human genetics have identified multiple bottlenecks in our evolutionary history. The most famous and dramatic was the out of Africa bottleneck that occurred when modern humans left Africa between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. A small group, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, crossed from Africa into Asia, eventually giving rise to all non-African populations. This explains why people whose ancestors come from Europe, Asia, Australia, or the Americas show less genetic diversity than African populations. Their ancestry passed through a narrow bottleneck that eliminated much of the genetic variation present in Africa. But bottlenecks also occurred within Africa, long before the out of Africa migration. Genetic analyses comparing different African populations and examining ancient DNA have revealed evidence of population contractions and expansions throughout the period when modern humans were evolving. These African bottlenecks appear to have been driven primarily by climate changes, the same dramatic environmental swings we discussed earlier. One particularly severe bottleneck seems to have occurred around 900,000 years ago, though the exact timing and severity remain subjects of ongoing research and debate. Genetic analyses published in 2023 suggested that the ancestral human population might have dropped to fewer than 1,300 individuals, sustained at this low level for over 100,000 years. Such a severe bottleneck would have had profound effects, eliminating most genetic variation and creating conditions where random genetic drift, the random change in gene frequencies that occurs in small populations, could have powerful effects. This proposal, based on statistical analyses of modern human genetic variation, has generated considerable scientific discussion. Some researchers question whether the genetic data truly reflects such a severe bottleneck or might instead reflect population structure, with multiple subpopulations existing separately rather than a single small population. Others point out that fossil evidence from this period shows hominin presence at multiple African sites, suggesting that populations existed in different regions. The debate illustrates an important point. Reconstructing ancient population sizes from modern genetic data requires making assumptions about population structure, migration patterns, and mutation rates, and different assumptions can lead to different conclusions. Regardless of the exact numbers, however, the general picture is clear. Human populations during the Middle Pleistocene were small by modern standards, probably numbering in the tens of thousands rather than millions, and they experienced periodic fluctuations driven by environmental changes. During favorable climate periods, populations would have grown and expanded into more territories. During harsh periods, particularly severe droughts or other environmental crises, populations would have contracted, perhaps dramatically. These periodic population contractions had several evolutionary consequences. First, they reduced genetic diversity, eliminating rare genetic variants from the population. This might seem purely negative, but it also meant that beneficial new mutations, if they arose, could spread through the population more rapidly. In a large population, a new beneficial mutation might take many generations to reach high frequency, potentially disappearing through random chance before it had the opportunity to spread. In a small population recovering from a bottleneck, a beneficial mutation had a better chance of increasing in frequency quickly. Second, bottlenecks intensified natural selection. When resources are scarce and survival is difficult, even small advantages can make the difference between surviving and perishing. Individuals with traits that help them cope with drought, find food in lean times, resist disease, or cooperate effectively with others would have been more likely to survive and reproduce. Their genes would have made up a larger proportion of the next generation's gene pool. Over multiple generations of harsh conditions, this selection could drive rapid evolutionary change. Third, bottlenecks created opportunities for what evolutionary biologists call founder effects. If a small group became isolated, perhaps retreating to a refuge area during harsh times, that group would carry only a subset of the ancestral population's genetic variation. If the group later expanded, perhaps when conditions improved, the descendants would reflect the limited genetic diversity of the founding group. This process, repeated multiple times across different refugia in different parts of Africa, could create the population structure we discussed earlier, with different subpopulations showing somewhat different genetic characteristics. The climate-driven population fluctuations in Africa meant that these processes occurred repeatedly during human evolution. Each major climate swing potentially created a bottleneck. Each population contraction and subsequent expansion represented an opportunity for evolutionary change. The result was not steady, gradual evolution but a pattern of punctuated change, periods of relative stasis interrupted by episodes of rapid transformation. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of discontinuous change. Stone tool technologies remained relatively unchanged for long periods, then shifted rapidly to new forms. The Acheulean hand axe technology persisted with little modification for more than 1 million years, from roughly 1.7 million years ago to around 300,000 years ago. Then, relatively rapidly in geological terms, it gave way to more diverse and sophisticated technologies. Behavioral innovations, such as the use of pigments for decoration or symbolic purposes, the creation of beads and other ornaments, and the production of abstract engravings, appear in the archaeological record somewhat suddenly rather than through gradual accumulation. One hypothesis links these behavioral innovations to population dynamics. The innovation amplification model proposes that innovations occur relatively frequently in human populations, but whether they persist and spread depends on population size and structure. In small, isolated populations, innovations might be lost through chance, forgotten when their inventors die, or disappear when population crashes eliminate the individuals who carried the cultural knowledge. In larger, better connected populations, innovations are more likely to be transmitted to others, to be refined and improved, and to become part of the persistent cultural repertoire. Climate changes that first reduced populations, creating bottlenecks and hardship, might have selected for increased cognitive abilities and behavioral flexibility. Then, when conditions improved and populations grew and reconnected, these increased abilities manifested in cultural innovations that could now spread and be maintained in the larger populations. This creates an apparent paradox. Bottlenecks, which we might think would harm cultural complexity by reducing population size, might actually promote it by intensifying selection for intelligence and then allowing that intelligence to express itself culturally during subsequent population growth. Genetic studies have identified specific genes that show evidence of recent selection in human populations, meaning they changed frequency more rapidly than would be expected by chance. Some of these genes affect brain development and function. They show signs of positive selection during the period when modern humans were evolving, suggesting that changes in brain structure or function were actively favored by natural selection. The timing of these selection signals sometimes coincides with major climate shifts or population bottlenecks, supporting the hypothesis that these events drove cognitive evolution. One particularly interesting case involves the FOXP2 gene, which affects language and speech development. Humans have a version of this gene that differs from the version found in other primates. Mutations in this gene in humans cause severe speech and language impairments. Genetic analyses initially suggested that the human version arose relatively recently, perhaps within the past 200,000 years, coinciding with the emergence of behaviorally modern humans. More recent and refined analyses have complicated this picture, but the broader point remains. Genes affecting uniquely human abilities show evidence of recent evolutionary change during the period when modern humans were evolving in Africa. Population bottlenecks also had demographic consequences that shaped human behavior and social structure. Small populations are vulnerable to extinction from random events. Disease outbreaks, local catastrophes, random fluctuations in birth and death rates. Surviving in small populations requires social cohesion and cooperation. Groups that could maintain social bonds, that cared for their sick and injured, that shared resources during times of scarcity, had better chances of survival than groups that fractured under pressure. This might help explain the evolution of distinctly human forms of cooperation and altruism. Humans cooperate with non-relatives to degrees unusual among primates. We form large groups with complex divisions of labor. We follow social norms and punish those who violate them. We engage in costly behaviors that benefit others, sometimes at significant personal cost. These behaviors likely evolved through a complex interplay of genetic evolution and cultural evolution, favored by conditions where group success determined individual survival. During population bottlenecks, when groups were small and survival was precarious, the benefits of cooperation would have been particularly stark. A group that could maintain unity and mutual support might survive where fractious groups perished. The genes and cultural practices that promoted cooperation would have been strongly favored, spreading through the population as it recovered from the bottleneck. Modern hunter-gatherer societies, while not perfect analogs for ancient humans, provide some insights into how small populations cope with environmental variability. Many such societies have elaborate social mechanisms for maintaining group cohesion, sharing norms that ensure food is distributed even when some individuals are more successful hunters or gatherers, rituals that reinforce social bonds, conflict resolution mechanisms that prevent disputes from fracturing the group, and networks of relationships with other groups that allow movement and resource sharing when local conditions become difficult. These mechanisms are cultural, transmitted through learning rather than genetics, but they rest on psychological foundations that are likely partly genetic. The emotional systems that make us feel good when we cooperate, that make us feel guilty when we violate social norms, that allow us to empathize with others' suffering, that motivate us to help even when there is no immediate benefit. The evolution of these psychological foundations may have been accelerated during periods when populations were small and cooperation was essential for survival. The out-of-Africa bottleneck, which occurred as modern humans left Africa between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, deserves special attention because its effects are particularly visible in modern genetic data. A small group left Africa, perhaps numbering only a few thousand individuals, and from this group descended all non-African populations. This bottleneck reduced genetic diversity dramatically. European populations show roughly 70 to 80% of the genetic diversity found in African populations. Asian populations show similar levels. Native American populations, descended from groups that passed through additional bottlenecks during their migrations from Asia to the Americas, show even less diversity. This pattern has practical consequences. Most genetic variants that exist in human populations are found in Africa. Many variants found in non-African populations are also found in Africa, but the reverse is not true. Many African genetic variants never left Africa because they were not present in the small founding population that migrated out. This means that studies of human genetic variation, including studies of disease-causing mutations, must include African populations to capture the full range of human genetic diversity. The out-of-Africa bottleneck also affects our understanding of human evolution. Because non-African populations passed through this severe bottleneck very recently in evolutionary time, their genetic patterns are dominated by its effects. African populations, while also affected by earlier bottlenecks, did not experience this most recent severe reduction. They preserve more information about ancient population structure and evolutionary dynamics. This makes Africa crucial not only as the place where humans evolved, but as the place that preserves the fullest record of human evolution in the form of genetic variation. The story of bottlenecks is ultimately a story of survival against odds. Multiple times during human evolution, our ancestors faced circumstances that reduced their numbers dramatically, that pushed them to the edge of extinction. Yet they survived, and in surviving they were changed. The challenges they faced selected for intelligence, for cooperation, for flexibility and innovation. The genetic diversity they lost was, in some cases, replaced by new mutations that spread rapidly through small populations. The social bonds they forged in times of crisis became foundations for more complex societies during times of plenty. As you sink deeper into rest, consider the resilience this implies. Your ancestors, countless generations of them, survived droughts and famines, predators and diseases, climate catastrophes and population crashes. Every human alive today descends from those survivors, carrying in their genes the evidence of those ancient struggles and the adaptations that made survival possible. Humans are extraordinarily social creatures. We live in groups ranging from families to nations. We cooperate with strangers, follow social norms, and build institutions that coordinate the behavior of millions. We create art, music, literature, science, technology, all fundamentally social endeavors that depend on accumulating knowledge across generations and sharing it within communities. This social complexity is one of humanity's most distinctive features, setting us apart from even our closest relatives, the great apes. Understanding how and why humans evolved such extreme sociality requires looking at the conditions under which our ancestors lived, conditions that existed with particular intensity in Africa during the Pleistocene. Social behavior exists throughout the animal kingdom, of course. Many species live in groups, cooperate with relatives, and engage in complex social interactions. But human sociality has several features that appear unusual or unique. We cooperate extensively with non-relatives, something relatively rare in nature where cooperation typically occurs among kin who share genes. We follow social norms and punish norm violators even when doing so is personally costly. We teach others explicitly, intentionally sharing knowledge rather than merely letting others learn through observation. We participate in collective rituals and cultural practices that create shared identities and group cohesion. We use language to coordinate behavior, share information about distant events, and transmit cultural knowledge across generations. The evolution of these behaviors likely involved both genetic changes that shaped our psychology and cultural changes that built on those psychological foundations. The two processes likely reinforced each other. Genetic evolution creating psychological capacities that enabled cultural complexity. Cultural evolution creating environments that favored genes supporting social behavior. This gene-culture coevolution accelerated during the period when modern humans were evolving in Africa, driven by the environmental and social challenges our ancestors faced. Climate variability played a crucial role in selecting for cooperation and social complexity. When environments change rapidly and unpredictably, individuals cannot rely solely on inherited behaviors fixed by genetic evolution. Genetic evolution is too slow to track rapid environmental changes effectively. Instead, populations need behavioral flexibility, the ability to innovate new solutions to novel problems and to transmit those solutions to others quickly. This creates conditions favoring cultural evolution, the accumulation and transmission of learned knowledge and practices. But cultural evolution works best in social contexts. Innovations must be observed and learned by others to persist beyond their inventor's lifetime. Knowledge must be shared to spread through populations. Skills must be taught to be passed to future generations. This creates selection pressure for psychological traits that facilitate social learning. The tendency to watch and imitate others, especially successful individuals. The ability to understand what others are doing and why. The motivation to teach others, sharing knowledge even when doing so involves costs in time and effort. Archaeological evidence suggests that cultural evolution accelerated dramatically during the period when modern humans were evolving in Africa. The Middle Stone Age, spanning from roughly 300,000 to 30,000 years ago, shows increasing diversity and sophistication in material culture. Early in this period, stone tools were relatively simple, but by the later phases, people were producing specialized tools for specific purposes, carefully crafting blades and points, using composite tools with multiple parts bound together, and even creating standardized tool forms that required extensive training to manufacture. The appearance of symbolic behavior during this period provides particularly compelling evidence for cognitive and social change. The earliest definite evidence for personal ornaments, shell beads with holes drilled through them for stringing, comes from sites in South Africa and North Africa dating to around 100,000 years ago. These beads required considerable effort to make. collecting appropriate shells, perforating them without breaking them, stringing them together. They had no practical function for survival. Their value was symbolic, perhaps indicating group membership, individual status, or personal identity. The use of ochre for purposes beyond simple coloration became more elaborate during this period as well. Sites contain not just pieces of ochre but grinding equipment, containers for storing pigment, and even pieces of ochre with engraved geometric patterns. One famous example from Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating to about 73,000 years ago, shows an ochre piece with a complex cross-hatched pattern deliberately engraved into its surface. This is not accidental marks from use. It is deliberate art, perhaps the oldest known drawing, evidence of minds capable of creating abstract symbols. These symbolic behaviors are fundamentally social. Ornaments communicate information to others: who you are, what group you belong to, what status you hold. Art creates shared meanings within communities, symbols that group members understand but outsiders might not. The archaeological appearance of these behaviors suggests the emergence of more complex social structures, societies where individual identity, group membership, and social relationships were marked and maintained through material symbols and cultural practices. Language, humanity's most sophisticated form of communication, likely also underwent important developments during this period, though its evolution remains difficult to trace directly because language does not fossilize. Indirect evidence comes from anatomy. The hyoid bone, a small bone in the throat that anchors muscles used in speech, has been found in Homo sapiens fossils and shows a modern configuration. The shape of the skull base and the position of the larynx in modern humans differ from those in other primates in ways that enhance the range of sounds we can produce. These anatomical changes were present by the time modern Homo sapiens appeared, suggesting the capacity for spoken language existed at least 300,000 years ago. But having the capacity for language does not necessarily mean using it in complex ways. The full flowering of language as a system for transmitting complex information, telling stories, discussing abstract concepts, and teaching sophisticated skills may have developed more gradually. Some researchers propose that initially, language might have served simpler functions, coordinating activities, indicating emotions, making simple requests. Over time, as social groups became larger and more complex, as cultural knowledge accumulated, as the need to transmit information across generations increased, language became more elaborate, developing grammar, syntax, and the ability to express increasingly abstract and complex ideas. The evolution of language and symbolic thought had profound effects on cooperation and social complexity. Language allows precise coordination of group activities. Hunters can plan strategies, discussing where to go, how to surround prey, what each person will do. Gatherers can share information about where foods are located, when they will ripen, how to process them. Teachers can explain techniques to learners, not just demonstrating but describing, answering questions, correcting mistakes. This dramatically accelerates cultural learning compared to simple observation and imitation. Language also enables reputation systems that support cooperation among non-relatives. Humans cooperate with strangers far more than other primates do, even in circumstances where the benefits are uncertain or delayed. This is puzzling from a narrow evolutionary perspective. Why help someone who might not reciprocate, who might cheat or defect? Part of the answer lies in reputation. If word spreads about who cooperates and who cheats, people can adjust their behavior accordingly, cooperating with those who have good reputations and avoiding or punishing those who don't. Language makes sophisticated reputation systems possible by allowing people to gossip, to share information about others' past behavior, to build and maintain complex social networks where reputation matters. The archaeological record from Africa shows evidence of increasingly extensive social networks during the late Pleistocene. Stone tools made from raw materials that originated hundreds of kilometers from where the finished tools were found indicate either long-distance travel or exchange networks. Shell beads made from marine shells appear at sites far inland, again suggesting either long-distance movement or trade. These networks would have allowed innovations to spread more widely, genetic diversity to be maintained despite local population fluctuations, and groups to access resources from different ecological zones through exchange relationships. Large-scale cooperation, the kind that allows hundreds or thousands of people to coordinate their behavior and work toward common goals, requires additional social innovations beyond simple reciprocity and reputation. It requires institutions, stable social structures that persist beyond individual lifetimes, rules and norms that people follow even when it is personally costly, mechanisms for resolving conflicts and punishing rule breakers. While large-scale institutions are primarily a development of the past 10,000 years, associated with agriculture and settled communities, their foundations likely lie in the social and cognitive developments that occurred during the African Middle and Late Pleistocene. One crucial foundation is norm psychology, the human tendency to follow social rules and to feel compelled to enforce them. Humans internalize norms, feeling guilt when we violate them even if no one is watching. We punish norm violators, even when the violation did not harm us personally. This seems irrational from an individual cost-benefit perspective. Why invest time and energy in punishing someone who wrongs someone else? But from a group-level perspective, it makes sense. Groups whose members enforce norms can maintain cooperation and prevent exploitation. Groups that cannot maintain norms are vulnerable to collapse as cheaters and free riders undermine cooperative efforts. Experimental studies of human behavior, including comparisons between humans and other primates, reveal that norm following and norm enforcement appear early in human development and are much stronger in humans than in our closest relatives. Even young children follow rules taught to them and protest when others violate those rules. Chimpanzees, while capable of cooperation and of responding to unfair treatment, do not show the same strong tendency to enforce norms or to follow rules in the absence of personal benefit. These psychological differences likely reflect genetic evolution shaped by the demands of living in large, complex social groups. During the period when modern humans were evolving in Africa, groups that could maintain cooperative norms had advantages over groups that could not. They could undertake collective actions that benefited the group even when individuals were tempted to shirk. Collective hunts of large game, collective defense against neighboring groups, collective resource management that prevented overexploitation of local resources. The genetic evidence supports the idea that these psychological traits evolved relatively recently. Several genes affecting social behavior and emotional regulation show signs of recent positive selection in humans, meaning they changed in ways that were actively favored by natural selection during the period when modern humans were evolving. While we cannot yet connect specific genetic changes to specific behavioral traits with certainty, the overall pattern suggests that the evolution of modern human psychology involved genetic changes affecting social cognition and behavior. Environmental variability in Africa may have been particularly important in driving the evolution of cooperation. In stable environments, individuals and families can rely on their own efforts and resources. But in variable environments, where local conditions can suddenly become harsh, cooperation and social networks become much more valuable. When your region experiences drought but a neighboring region does not, having social connections that allow you to move temporarily or obtain food through exchange can mean the difference between survival and starvation. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherers, particularly those living in highly variable environments, show extensive networks of social relationships that serve as insurance against local resource failures. For example, groups in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa maintain relationships with groups dozens or hundreds of kilometers away. During good times, these relationships are maintained through visits, gift exchanges, and participation in regional gatherings. During bad times, when local resources fail, people can activate these relationships, temporarily joining other groups, calling on exchange partners, or accessing resources in other territories. These networks require considerable social intelligence to maintain. remembering who owes you what, tracking complex networks of relationships, negotiating access to resources, resolving disputes when interests conflict. They also require cultural institutions, rules about hospitality and reciprocity, rituals that reinforce relationships, mechanisms for integrating outsiders into groups temporarily. The fact that such networks are widespread among hunter-gatherers living in variable environments suggests they may have deep roots, perhaps extending back to when our ancestors faced similar challenges in variable Pleistocene African environments. Cooperation also extended to child rearing, another domain where humans differ markedly from other primates. Human children develop slowly, remaining dependent on adults for years and not reaching full maturity until their late teens or early 20s. This extended childhood is partly a consequence of our large brains, which require extended periods to develop and which make human infants vulnerable and dependent. Supporting these slow-developing offspring requires extensive parental investment, and in humans this investment extends beyond just the mother. Human fathers typically invest more in their offspring than males of other primate species, providing food, protection, and care. Grandmothers, particularly maternal grandmothers, often play important roles in helping to raise grandchildren, allowing their daughters to have more children more quickly than would otherwise be possible. Other group members, including aunts, uncles, and unrelated individuals, also contribute to child care in many human societies. This cooperative breeding, where multiple individuals help raise offspring, is unusual among primates but common in humans. The evolution of cooperative breeding likely relates to the challenges of raising large-brained, slow-developing offspring in variable African environments. In stable, resource-rich environments, mothers might be able to raise offspring alone or with minimal help. But in variable environments, where resources fluctuate and mothers sometimes struggle to meet their own needs, much less those of dependent offspring, having help from others becomes crucial. Groups that could coordinate childcare, where multiple adults contributed to raising the next generation, could maintain higher fertility and lower child mortality than groups where mothers struggled alone. This created another set of selection pressures for cooperation and for the social emotions that support it. Feeling affection for children who are not your own, being willing to share food with them, being motivated to protect them from danger, all these emotions support cooperative breeding. Evolution could favor these tendencies because in small groups, many children would be relatives, so helping them indirectly helps your own genes. But the tendencies, once evolved, extend beyond kin, creating a psychological foundation for more general cooperation and altruism. The role of grandmothers deserves particular attention. Human females, unlike those of most other species, undergo menopause, ceasing reproduction years or even decades before death. This is puzzling from a direct reproductive perspective. Why stop reproducing if you are still capable of surviving? The grandmother hypothesis proposes that older women can contribute more to their genetic legacy by helping raise grandchildren than by having more children of their own. Young mothers, still learning skills and building social networks, may struggle to provide adequately for multiple dependent children. Grandmothers, with decades of accumulated knowledge and established social relationships, can provide crucial help that increases their grandchildren's survival and well-being. This hypothesis finds support in demographic studies showing that in populations without modern medicine, the presence of a maternal grandmother significantly increases grandchildren's survival, while the presence of a paternal grandmother has weaker or no effect. The pattern makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Maternal grandmothers can be certain of their genetic relationship to their daughter's children, while paternal grandmothers face some uncertainty because of the possibility of extra-pair paternity. The evolution of menopause and the grandmother role may have been particularly favored in environments like those in Africa, where variable conditions made the assistance of experienced, knowledgeable older women especially valuable. Social complexity in humans also manifests in the creation and maintenance of cultural traditions that vary between groups. Different populations develop different ways of making tools, different hunting strategies, different food preparation techniques, different marriage customs, different belief systems. These traditions are not genetically determined. They are culturally transmitted, learned from others and passed down through generations. Yet they can be remarkably stable, persisting for centuries or millennia even as individuals come and go. The archaeological record from Africa shows regional variation in material culture extending back hundreds of thousands of years. Different regions use different stone tool technologies, different techniques for working bone and other materials, different styles of decoration. This regional variation suggests the existence of distinct cultural traditions, populations that maintain particular ways of doing things and pass them on to succeeding generations. Maintaining cultural traditions requires social learning mechanisms that go beyond simple observation and imitation. It requires active teaching with knowledgeable individuals deliberately instructing learners. It requires respect for tradition, a psychological tendency to value the ways of ancestors and to resist changing practices unnecessarily. It requires social sanctions against deviation, pressure to conform to group norms. These features are evident in ethnographic studies of modern traditional societies and likely characterized prehistoric human societies as well. The evolution of cultural traditions and the psychological mechanisms supporting them may have been driven partly by the benefits of cumulative cultural evolution. Cultural knowledge can accumulate over generations, with each generation adding to what they learned from the previous one. This allows human populations to develop technologies and practices far more sophisticated than any individual could invent alone. But accumulation requires faithful transmission across generations. If each generation reinvents everything from scratch, knowledge cannot accumulate. If transmission is too error-prone, knowledge degrades over time. The psychology that supports cultural traditions, the tendency to learn from others and to respect traditional knowledge, helps ensure faithful transmission while still allowing for innovation and improvement. Africa's environmental variability may have particularly favored cumulative cultural evolution. In variable environments, accumulated knowledge about how to cope with different conditions becomes valuable. Knowing what plants can be eaten during droughts, where water can be found during dry seasons, how to hunt particular animals that become more important during certain periods. All this knowledge helps populations survive environmental fluctuations. The knowledge accumulates over generations as people experience different conditions and learn from them. Populations with strong cultural traditions that preserve this knowledge across generations have advantages over populations that must rediscover solutions to recurring problems. We have explored the separate threads: climate variability, geographic isolation, predator-prey interactions, genetic bottlenecks, and social complexity. Now we must weave these threads together to answer our central question. Why did humans evolve only in Africa? Why not in Asia, Europe, or other continents where other human ancestors or relatives lived? The answer lies not in any single factor but in the unique combination that existed in Africa during the critical period of human evolution. Each thread alone might have driven significant evolutionary change, but together they created conditions unlike those anywhere else on Earth, conditions that transformed a relatively unremarkable African ape into the species that would eventually dominate the planet. Begin with geography and deep time. Africa is where our lineage has lived longest. The earliest primates, small tree-dwelling mammals, evolved around 60 million years ago, and while they eventually spread to other continents, Africa remained a center of primate diversity and evolution. The earliest apes appeared in Africa around 20 to 25 million years ago. The last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, lived in Africa approximately 6 to 7 million years ago. Our lineage did not suddenly appear. It grew from roots extending deep into African soil. This long residence mattered because evolution is a cumulative process. Each species is built on the foundation of its ancestors. The early hominins, the Australopithecines who first walked upright, were adapted to African environments. Their descendants, the early members of genus Homo, inherited those adaptations and built upon them. Each successive species was shaped by and adapted to African conditions. By the time Homo sapiens appeared, our lineage had spent millions of years evolving in Africa, developing traits specifically suited to African environments. Contrast this with Eurasia. Homo erectus left Africa around 1.8 million years ago and spread across much of Asia and into Europe. These populations adapted to their new environments, evolving into forms distinct from those remaining in Africa. The Neanderthals of Europe and Western Asia evolved cold adaptations suited to Ice Age climates. The Denisovans, recently discovered from DNA evidence in fragmentary fossils, occupied parts of Asia and apparently developed high-altitude adaptations. These were sophisticated humans with large brains and complex behaviors, but they were not Homo sapiens. They had diverged from the African lineage long before modern humans appeared. When modern Homo sapiens left Africa between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, they encountered these archaic human populations. Genetic evidence shows that they interbred with them. Modern people of non-African descent carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA, and some Asian and Oceanian populations also carry Denisovan DNA. But these archaic populations eventually disappeared, replaced by or absorbed into the expanding modern human population. Why did modern humans, originating in Africa, eventually prevail over other human species that had adapted to Eurasian environments for hundreds of thousands of years? The answer likely relates to the complete suite of modern human traits, the cognitive and social abilities that evolved in Africa during the period we have been discussing. Modern humans did not simply have bigger brains than earlier hominins. Many aspects of brain structure were also different. The brain became more globular, with expanded areas associated with social cognition, planning, and symbolic thought. These changes appear in the fossil record around the time modern humans emerged and may reflect genetic changes affecting brain development. Modern humans also developed more sophisticated technologies and more complex social structures than archaic humans. The archaeological record from Africa during the Middle Stone Age shows innovations that appear earlier or more extensive than in contemporary Eurasian sites. Varied stone tool forms, use of bone and other organic materials for tools, production of ornaments and art, evidence of long-distance exchange networks. By the Late Stone Age in Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago, human material culture was remarkably diverse and sophisticated, more so than contemporary Neanderthal culture in Europe. These differences likely stemmed from the particular evolutionary pressures operating in Africa. The extreme climate variability, the pattern of rapid shifts between different environmental states, favored cognitive flexibility and behavioral adaptability to a degree that more stable environments did not. Eurasia experienced climate changes during the Pleistocene, of course. Ice ages caused massive ice sheets to advance and retreat, sea levels to fall and rise, vegetation zones to shift. But many of these changes, while dramatic, were relatively predictable, following the rhythms of orbital cycles. More importantly, they created conditions that often reduced the habitable area available to hominin populations rather than creating diverse microenvironments within refugia. During European glacial periods, much of the continent became too cold for hominin habitation. Neanderthals and earlier populations retreated to southern refugia in Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans. These populations might grow during interglacial periods when climate warmed and expanded northward, then contract again during the next glaciation. This pattern of expansion and contraction continued for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals evolved impressive cold adaptations, robust bodies that conserved heat, and sophisticated hunting strategies suited to Ice Age fauna. But the environmental challenges they faced, while severe, followed predictable patterns and in many ways became more extreme versions of the same challenges. Hunting large game in cold, open environments. Compare this with a pattern in Africa. Instead of a single major environmental type becoming more or less extensive, Africa contained multiple environments that changed in complex, sometimes opposite ways. The rainforests of Central Africa expanded and contracted but never disappeared entirely. The savannas and woodlands of eastern and southern Africa shifted in extent but persisted somewhere on the continent. The deserts expanded during dry periods and shrank during humid periods, but populations could persist in refugia. The pattern was not simple expansion and contraction but complex mosaics of environments changing at different rates in different regions. This created what researchers call a landscape of evolutionary opportunity. Different populations experienced different selective pressures at different times. Innovations that arose in one population could, during periods of reconnection, spread to others. Genetic and cultural diversity was maintained despite periodic bottlenecks because the bottlenecks did not affect all populations simultaneously. The subdivided population structure we discussed earlier, with multiple subpopulations experiencing partial isolation and occasional contact, created conditions particularly favorable for evolution. The predator-prey ecosystem added another layer of pressure that was particularly intense in Africa. Eurasia had large predators, yes, but Africa's predator guild was uniquely diverse and persistent. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, cave bears, and other impressive Pleistocene predators populated Eurasia at various times, but the megafaunal predator community of Africa remained stable and diverse throughout the period of human evolution. African hominins evolved alongside these predators over millions of years, in a continuous arms race that never let up. This constant pressure from diverse predators selected for different traits than the challenges faced by Eurasian populations. Neanderthals, powerful and robust, apparently hunted by ambush and close confrontation, using thrusting spears to kill large prey at close range. This was effective in the environments they inhabited but required great physical strength and involved high injury rates. Neanderthal fossils show evidence of frequent serious injuries consistent with close encounters with dangerous prey. African Homo sapiens developed different strategies, relying more on projectile weapons that allowed hunting from distance, on complex tracking and pursuit strategies that used intelligence and endurance rather than strength, and unsophisticated social coordination that allowed groups to hunt cooperatively while managing risks. These strategies transferred successfully to other environments when modern humans left Africa, allowing them to hunt the megafauna of Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas more effectively than resident populations in those regions. The genetic bottlenecks that punctuated African human evolution may have played crucial accelerating roles that did not occur to the same degree in Eurasian populations. Neanderthals and Denisovans also experienced population fluctuations, but the pattern was different. Their populations seem to have remained persistently small throughout their existence, numbering perhaps in the low tens of thousands and sometimes dropping to just a few thousand during harsh glacial periods. This chronic small population size would have reduced genetic diversity and potentially limited adaptive potential. African populations, by contrast, experienced dramatic fluctuations. During favorable periods, populations expanded significantly, reaching sizes where innovations could be maintained and cultural complexity could develop. During harsh periods, they contracted sharply, experiencing intense selection. This boom-bust pattern, driven by Africa's climate variability, created alternating periods of innovation during booms and selection during busts. Each cycle potentially drove rapid evolutionary change in ways that chronic small population size would not. The social and cultural evolution that accelerated during the African late Pleistocene built on genetic changes affecting cognition and behavior, but it also created its own evolutionary pressures. Once populations began developing complex cultural traditions, success depended increasingly on the ability to learn from others, to participate in social networks, to follow norms, and to transmit knowledge accurately. This created positive feedback. Genetic changes that enhanced cultural learning abilities were favored because they improved success in increasingly cultural environments, and this in turn supported more complex culture. which increased the advantages of cultural learning abilities, and so on. This gene-culture coevolution may have been particularly rapid in Africa because of the combination of environmental variability and population dynamics we have discussed. In stable environments with large populations, cultural evolution might occur gradually, with innovations accumulating slowly. In small, isolated populations, cultural knowledge might be lost faster than it accumulates. But in environments with intermediate conditions, populations large enough to maintain cultural traditions but experiencing enough variability to favor innovation, cultural evolution could accelerate. Africa during the late Pleistocene may have provided these optimal conditions more consistently than other regions. The subdivided population structure meant some subpopulations were always large enough to maintain traditions, even if others shrank during harsh periods. The environmental variability meant innovations were constantly being tested under different conditions. The eventual reconnection of populations meant successful innovations could spread widely rather than remaining confined to isolated groups. By the time modern humans left Africa, they carried with them a full suite of adaptations forged by the unique African crucible. They had bodies adapted to endurance and efficiency rather than pure power, suited to covering long distances in varied terrain. They had minds capable of remarkable flexibility, able to learn complex skills, solve novel problems, and adjust to new circumstances. They had sophisticated language allowing precise communication and transmission of cultural knowledge. They had strong tendencies toward cooperation and social learning, allowing them to function effectively in large groups and to accumulate cultural knowledge across generations. They had technologies including projectile weapons, sophisticated tools, and almost certainly nets, traps, and other devices that have not preserved archaeologically. When these modern humans entered regions occupied by archaic human populations, they brought advantages forged over hundreds of thousands of years in the challenging African environments. They did not necessarily outcompete archaic humans in direct confrontation. The process of replacement took thousands of years and in some cases involved interbreeding. But gradually, over time, modern humans became the dominant form everywhere they spread. The question, why only Africa, thus resolves into why anywhere else? The conditions that drove human evolution, the specific combination of climate variability, geographic structure, ecological pressures, population dynamics, and resulting social and cultural evolution, existed with particular intensity in Africa. Other regions experienced some of these pressures, but not the full combination. Evolution occurred elsewhere, certainly. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not static but continued evolving in their respective ranges. But the particular transformation that led to modern humans, the species with global reach and planet-changing capabilities, occurred in Africa because only Africa provided the complete set of conditions necessary for that transformation. This is not a claim of African superiority or of deterministic inevitability. There was nothing inevitable about human evolution. If conditions had been slightly different, if key mutations had not occurred, if bottlenecks had been too severe or not severe enough, if any of countless other factors had varied, the outcome might have been completely different. Humans might never have evolved at all, or different forms of intelligence might have arisen. The fact that it happened in Africa reflects the contingent details of Earth's geography, climate history, and ecological patterns during a particular period. But it did happen, and it happened in Africa. Every human alive today, regardless of where they now live or where their recent ancestors came from, ultimately traces their deepest roots to Africa. The DNA in your cells carries markers of African origin. The structure of your brain reflects adaptations that evolved in African environments. Your capacity for language, for cooperation, for cultural learning, for symbolic thought, all these emerged from evolutionary processes that unfolded under African skies. You are, in the deepest sense, African, as is every other member of our species. This shared African origin has profound implications. It means that the genetic differences between human populations are superficial. Recent adaptations to local conditions overlaid on a fundamental African foundation. It means that all humans are closely related, far more closely than most other species are across their geographic ranges. It means that the divisions we create, the boundaries between nations and peoples and races, are recent cultural constructs, not deep biological realities. We are all one family, all children of Africa, all products of the same long evolutionary journey that began millions of years ago on that remarkable continent. As you rest now, reflecting on this long journey through time, consider the implications of this story. You are the product of millions of years of evolution, shaped by forces you never directly experienced but which are recorded in your genes, your brain, your psychology. The challenges your ancestors faced in African landscapes, the climate swings they endured, the predators they evaded or hunted, the social groups they formed, all of this shaped what you are today. Your ability to learn languages as a child, to form deep friendships, to cooperate with strangers, to solve problems creatively, to feel wonder at the stars or beauty in music. All these capacities trace back to evolutionary developments that occurred in Africa during the Pleistocene. Your ancestors survived drought and famine not through individual strength alone but through cooperation and knowledge sharing. They survived predators not through armor or speed but through intelligence and planning. They survived rapid environmental changes not through physical specialization but through behavioral flexibility. These are the gifts of your African heritage. The capacity for adaptation, for learning, for working together, for creating new solutions to new problems. When modern humans left Africa and spread across the globe, they carried these gifts with them. They adapted to frozen tundras and tropical islands, to high mountains and arid deserts, to every terrestrial environment on Earth. Later, they would adapt to agricultural societies, to cities, to industrial civilization, to the information age. Each adaptation built on the foundation laid during the African Pleistocene. The story of human evolution is often told as a march of progress, a ladder climbing from primitive to advanced. This is misleading. Evolution is not progress toward a predetermined goal. It is adaptation to specific circumstances. Humans are not the pinnacle of evolution, the ultimate endpoint toward which all life strives. We are simply one species among millions, adapted to particular circumstances, successful in our ecological niche but not superior in any objective sense. What makes human evolution remarkable is not that it produced a superior being but that it produced a being capable of understanding its own evolution, of reconstructing its own history, of wondering about its place in nature. The human mind, forged in the African crucible, eventually developed the capacity for science, for systematic investigation of the natural world. That same mind can now look back across the millions of years of its own evolution and trace the path that led from tree-dwelling primates to spacefaring civilizations. This capacity for self-reflection, for understanding our own origins, gives us both knowledge and responsibility. We know now that our species is young, emerging only recently from a long lineage of earlier hominins and before them other primates stretching back tens of millions of years. We know that our current success is a contingent outcome of particular circumstances, not an inevitable result or a permanent state. We know that the adaptations that served our ancestors well in Pleistocene Africa may not serve us well in modern circumstances, that our evolved psychology can sometimes lead us astray in the novel environments we have created. But we also know that we have remarkable capacities for learning and change. We are not prisoners of our evolutionary past. The same flexibility that allowed our ancestors to adapt to changing African environments allows us to adapt to new challenges. The same social learning abilities that allowed them to accumulate cultural knowledge allow us to build on what previous generations discovered. The same capacity for cooperation that allowed them to survive in small groups allows us to coordinate actions across nations and continents. As you drift toward sleep now, let your mind rest on this knowledge. You are part of an unbroken chain extending back through millions of years, through countless generations of ancestors who survived, who adapted, who learned, who passed on what they knew to their children. Every one of your ancestors, without exception, survived long enough to reproduce. You exist because they persisted, because they overcame whatever challenges they faced. The journey that brought humanity out of Africa to every corner of the globe is not finished. It continues in every child born, in every innovation created, in every problem solved, in every kindness shown. The qualities that made humans successful in Pleistocene Africa, flexibility, cooperation, intelligence, and creativity, are still present, still powerful, still shaping human destiny. Africa remains humanity's home in a profound sense. It is where we began, where the foundations of human nature were laid. Understanding this helps us understand ourselves, our capacities, our limitations, our common humanity. We are all Africans, all products of that ancient crucible where climate, geography, ecology, and chance combine to create something unique. The fossils lie silent in museums now, those ancient bones that tell the story of human origins. The stone tools, chipped and shaped by hands millions of years ago, rest in collections around the world. The DNA evidence accumulates in databases, analyzed by computers, revealing patterns of ancient migrations and mixings. The scientific papers multiply, each adding small pieces to the larger picture. But the fundamental truth remains simple. Humans evolved in Africa, and only in Africa, because only Africa provided the unique combination of challenges that forged modern humanity. As sleep approaches, let this knowledge bring comfort. You are the descendant of survivors, of adapters, of innovators. The same forces that shaped your ancestors shaped you. The same capacities that allowed them to transform from vulnerable primates to planet-spanning species live on in you. Whatever challenges you face, you carry within you the legacy of millions of years of evolution, tested and refined in Earth's most demanding crucible. Rest now. Let the story settle into your mind like sediment layering in an ancient lake bed, preserving the past for future discovery. You have traveled millions of years tonight, from the first bipedal steps on African soil to the global human presence today. You have witnessed climate swings that would have destroyed less adaptable species, geographic barriers that might have prevented evolution but instead guided it, predators that might have eliminated early humans but instead sharpened their minds, bottlenecks that might have driven extinction but instead accelerated change, and social developments that transformed isolated individuals into cooperating communities capable of remarkable achievements. This is your heritage. This is the story of how you came to be. Africa was not just one possible birthplace among many. It was the only place where the full combination of factors necessary for human evolution came together at the right time in the right ways. Geography, climate, ecology, and chance all played their parts, creating conditions that existed nowhere else on Earth during the critical period when human ancestors were evolving into modern humans. The journey from African origins to global presence took most of human history. The journey to understanding those origins has taken only the past century and a half, since Darwin first proposed African origins and the first fossils began to accumulate. The story is still being written, new fossils still being found, new genetic analyses still revealing surprises. But the fundamental narrative is now clear, supported by evidence from multiple fields all pointing to the same conclusion. You evolved in Africa. Your species evolved only in Africa. And that African heritage shaped everything you are and everything humanity has become. Hold that truth gently as you drift into sleep. You are African. You are human. You are the product of the most remarkable evolutionary journey on Earth. Rest well, child of Africa, descendant of the Great Transformation, inheritor of millions of years of adaptation and survival. If you enjoyed this journey through time and the story of our African origins, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these deep explorations of history, science, and the stories that shape our understanding of ourselves. Until next time, sleep well and remember, we are all one human family, all children of Africa, all connected by the deepest roots imaginable. Good night.